So we've spent 2 weeks introducing the book of Ruth, and all of that introduction was necessary to give us that background that the original readers of Ruth, they would have known all of those background stories and the history leading up to it and its historical setting as they heard this book. And so we need to have all of those things in the back of our minds as we hear this story unfold. So today we're going to start to dig into the story and see what we can hear God saying to us through it. So Naomi has heard that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. It's there in verse 6. We saw last week that the Lord was active in sending the famine, so now he is active in bringing that famine to an end. This word visit speaks not just of location, but also of intention. It's sometimes, often, translated in the Old Testament as punish, when its context is God coming in judgment. It's also the language that was used in Exodus. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, this is Moses speaking, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Lord has observed his people, and he is going to act to do something about it. Then a bit later, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. The Lord visited. The Lord visiting us means he sees us and he intends to do something about our situation, whether that be judgment or redemption. So he was active in sending the famine. He visited his people with the famine. Now he has visited his people again and given them food. Acknowledging that the Lord's hand is in all things, bad and good, is key to us responding appropriately to whatever happens in life. When famine comes, we know we must humble ourselves and repent. When famine ends, we must be thankful to the Father for his good and undeserved gifts. Modern science has shaped our thinking so that we attribute things like famine and fruitfulness to chance or to laws of nature. Why is it so hot this week? Is it just because of the meteorological things that happen in the atmosphere? Or do we see that the Lord's hand is behind it for some reason that's maybe mysterious to us? But science has said, well, no, it's just cause and effect, the laws of nature. But we still can't avoid feeling a need to personalise things, can we? We call our weather patterns La Nina, which means little girl, or El Nino, the little boy. We give names to cyclones, and I think it's more than just so we can easily catalogue them. I think it betrays our suppressed knowledge that there is a person behind all that happens in creation. When we hear of ancient people assigning various gods to different aspects of nature or things that happen in nature, we tend to think that their problem was ignorance. They didn't know science. They didn't understand why things happened, so they had the God of the gaps, where anything they couldn't understand, they just said, well, that's the gods doing that. But the Bible's diagnosis is different. It says the issue isn't that we see a spiritual power behind the things that happen in the world. The problem is which spiritual power we attribute it to. Is it the gods of our imagination, or is it the true and living God? Science seeks explanations. And it ends up pointing us to these impersonal laws of nature. But we shouldn't see science as being there to give us a reason, but simply a description of how God is at work in his creation to move things towards his goal. The things we call laws of nature, they're just our observation of God, the Creator, who is a God of order, upholding all things by his powerful word. So it's not primitive or superstitious to see God's hand in the weather. That's actually the realistic view, because it says everything that happens is all working towards God's good purpose. It enables us then to face whatever happens, good or bad, not with fatalism, but with the kind of hope that's expressed in Romans 8. It says all of creation is groaning in anticipation of the freedom that it will know when God's children are revealed. Now, there's a deliberate contrast in verse 6 with verse 1 here. Verse 6 is the first time that the Lord is mentioned in the book. It's almost as if verses 1 to 5, up to this point, people are just going about their business without reference to the Lord, living under the sun, living as if life is, as Ecclesiastes says, vain and meaningless, as if above us there's only sky, as the song goes. But now it's like the Lord pulls back the curtain and makes himself known, not only in giving food to his people in Judah, but he's also bringing about a renewal in Naomi's heart. Her family had left Israel. They'd given up on the Lord and his covenant promises. They'd thrown their lot in with the gods of Moab. Now the Lord is making himself known again to Naomi. Not only has he visited his people in Israel, but he's visited the heart of this woman in the fields of Moab, just as he had visited his people slaving away on the plains of Egypt. Now this chapter introduces two big themes that run through the book of Ruth. First theme is that of returning or turning, and the second theme is that of emptiness and fullness. Let's look at this theme of returning. And the writer of Ruth makes a lot of use of this word. This word is translated as turn back or return. Out of the 13 times that this word appears in the book, 10 of them are in these verses from 6 to 22. Not just because it describes Naomi's actual journey returning back to Judah. Notice how the conversation that she has with her daughters-in-law, it isn't before she leaves, but it's while they're already on the way, in verse 7. It's like they're standing in an in-between place. As we see on the map, Judah on one side and Moab on the other. And see what separates the two? The body of water. It's a little bit of an imagery there of the Israelites having to cross through water to come into the land that God has promised them. This passage is a bit like watching a game of tennis, turning from side to side as if to ask, who will win, Moab or Judah? The false god Chemosh or the true God Yahweh? The author has set out the series of these words return in the structure of what's known as a chiasm. So Hebrew poetic form in which the key idea is found in the centre and the secondary ideas go out in opposite directions in a reverse parallelism. And we can see this structure when it's set out as a table. See how Naomi's goal at the start is to return from Moab to Judah with her daughters-in-law because they are all she has left. But then comes this tussle between the two options. Which land which people, which God will prevail over her daughters-in-law? Will she end up with them or without them? See, this is a choose this day whom you will serve moment. Same as was faced by Israel when they entered the promised land for the first time, and possibly in the same location. And in a sense, each daughter-in-law represents this constant tussle that is faced by Israel. Will they serve the Lord or will they serve the gods of the nations? And of course, the tussle that Israel knew is also the tussle we know, as we feel pulled in two directions all the time. At times, we feel firm in our faith in the Lord. At other times, we feel like the world is dragging us away. As we sing in that hymn, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. This isn't just Ruth and Naomi facing a tussle. This is a picture of all of God's people through the ages facing that pull between faith in the Lord and what the world is calling us to. Now, in the middle of this chiasm, where the pull of Moab seems the strongest, that's the moment of decision, verse 14. Orpah chooses to return to her Moabite mother, but Ruth chooses to turn to Ruth as her mother. And then, as we work our way out the other side, the tension comes to a resolution. As Naomi returns to Judah, she's both lost a daughter and she's gained one. Now see how the emphasis in the first half is on the need for the women to find husbands and to have children, and Naomi's inability to provide that for them. But in the second half, it's the gods of Moab versus the God of Israel. Orpah returns to her gods, but Ruth swears allegiance to Naomi's God. But that's what sets up the main dilemma of this story. Orpah returns to her people and gods, and she's assured that her mother will provide her with another husband, and she will find rest. But Ruth has sworn allegiance to Naomi, who's only found bitterness and emptiness from the hand of her God, whom she says in verse 13, she says, the hand of God who has gone out against me. So she follows Naomi without, humanly speaking, a guarantee that things are going to work out for her. Empty and bitter Naomi cannot provide her with a husband. And she's coming to a people who have been commanded by their God to not seek her people's welfare. So why should she throw her lot in with the God of Israel? What makes the Lord any different or any better than the gods of the nations? This is a question that we need to wrestle with, and a question we need to be prepared to know how to answer when friends and family and others seem to be living lives of comfort and ease and seemingly well-being. We feel like they don't need God. What do we have to offer them that's any better than what they have? Do we fall into the trap of thinking, well, we have to offer them an enhanced and better version of what they have? Well, that's what the prosperity gospel tries to do. Do we try to compete with the world, or at least match the world? Or can we say, are we prepared to say that when we come to Jesus, we may lose everything in this world, yet knowing Christ and the power of his resurrection and his death is far more valuable than anything that we might lose? Or do we live as if God is only good when he gives us the things that we want and like? This was the dilemma that was faced by Abraham when he was commanded to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham lived as a stranger among Canaanites who practiced child sacrifice. And having heard this command from God would have made him say, wait, I thought the Lord who chose me and called me was supposed to be different and better than these other gods. Yet here he is requiring the same horrific practice that these gods demand. The test of Abraham's faith was to believe that the Lord was unique, that he was better than the other gods. So when on the surface he looked just like a pagan as he went up the hill with his son, he was able to say to his son, God will provide for himself the lamb. And Hebrews tells us that even if God hadn't provided a substitute, Abraham knew that God was able to raise people from the dead. In other words, he believed that the Lord is different to the other gods because he provides a sacrifice to save us from death, and he's able to raise the dead to life. Two things that the Canaanite gods would never do and could never do. The point I'm making here is God tested Abraham's faith by presenting himself as if he was the same as all the other gods. But then by his actions, he showed himself to be anything but like those gods. We can actually say it was God himself who was being put to the test so that Abraham's faith would be firmly placed in him. What passed the test wasn't just Abraham's faith, but God's faithfulness. Well, this same test of character, of God's character, is happening here in Ruth. And the way that he will treat these two women from this point on will display his covenant love that no other God had. The false gods, well, they could send judgment. They could empty people and make them bitter. They could send famine and provide food when they so wished, or that's what the people believed about them. But what makes the Lord stand out from all the gods is his steadfast, redeeming covenant love for his people. No other god in ancient religion had ever entered into a covenant with human beings. See, in pagan thinking, gods would make covenant with other gods, and humans would make covenants with other humans, but a god would never stoop so low as to make a covenant with all of its promises, all of its commitments with mere mortals. A god would never bind themselves to a group of people with an unbreakable oath of faithfulness. Mortals were supposed to swear oaths to gods, but the thought of a god making promises to men and keeping them unconditionally, even in the face of sin and treachery, that was unheard of, except in Israel and her relationship with the Lord. So here's the dilemma that we will see the Lord resolve in this story. Will his covenant promises stand? And more so, will his covenant be shown to be effective and successful so that the people who live by faith in these promises will act then with the kind of righteousness that the covenant claims to be able to produce? The second big theme is that of emptying and filling. The first hint of what the Lord's about to do in his faithfulness to his covenant is in the concluding verse of this chapter. Naomi returned, Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. So there's the returning. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. See, we've come full circle with Ruth back in Bethlehem where she began, but it's a different Bethlehem to the one that she left. And she is a different woman to what she was when she left. Bethlehem, the house of bread, was empty because of famine, but she, in her own words, went away full because of her husband and her sons. Now she returns, brought back by the Lord, as an empty woman, with only one companion who may well end up just as empty as she. When she calls herself Mara, which means bitter, it's not just a contrast with her name, which means pleasant. It is, but there's more to it than that. It's echoing the experience of Israel in the wilderness. When thirsty after 3 days' travel, they came to a spring, but they found the water to be bitter, so they called it Marah. After they grumbled, the Lord turned the waters fresh. But then he did even more than that. He led them to a place called Elim, a place with 12 springs of abundant fresh water. At Marah, the Lord described himself to Israel as the Lord your healer. He said, I will protect you from the plagues of Egypt, if only you will obey me. So just as it healed the water, turning bitter into fresh, so he takes bitter people and he makes them whole. So Naomi is empty and bitter, but the Bethlehem she returns to is no longer empty. It's in the process of being filled by the barley harvest that's come as a result of the Lord visiting his people and giving them food. So full Naomi leaves empty Bethlehem, is herself emptied in Moab, and then empty Naomi returns to a full Bethlehem. And as the readers, we're supposed to anticipate that now she's returned, she once again will be filled. These themes of returning and of filling echo throughout the teaching of Jesus. He calls the thirsty and the hungry to come, to return to him for living water, for heavenly bread that will never run out. He calls those who are under the heavy yoke of legalism to return to him and find rest. He tells those who hunger and thirst for righteousness that they will be blessed, because with the coming of God's kingdom, they will be filled. But the place where these two themes, returning and emptying and filling, where they both clearly come together in a beautiful way, is in the parable that we heard read, what we call the parable of the prodigal son. So a son leaves his father's house full, or so he thinks, because he's demanded and been given the share of his inheritance. He doesn't yet see that if he'd simply stayed at home, he would have been in the same position as his older brother, in which everything that the father had would have been his. So he went away with maybe half. If he'd stayed, he would have shared in the whole lot. He goes away to a far country and he loses everything. And he becomes so empty that he longs to fill his stomach with pig food. So what's the solution? Return to his father, where as a servant he'll receive at least enough to live on. And he expects that he will have to grovel to his father and to accept a humble and lowly position, because he still sees his father as being like everyone else in the world, placing conditions and demands on his acceptance of him as a son. But he's about to receive a revelation that his father is unlike worldly fathers. This son is interrupted twice by his father, The first is in his act of returning. He gets up to return, but he doesn't actually have a chance to make it home under his own steam. When Jesus says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, that actually shows us that he was still in the far country. So the only way that his father could have seen him is because the father himself had come out to the far country to find him. You may have grown up with the imagery being presented that the father was there at home looking out the window, and when he was working in the field he was looking down the driveway, and then finally he saw his son turn up at the gate and he ran down the driveway. The image is the son is so far away he's lost. The father has come and found him and seen him. So the son returns not under his own steam, but because the father has visited him, like the Lord visiting his people. He comes and he brings him back. So he can take no credit for returning. He can only give glory to the Father for coming to get him. The second interruption is when the son starts his grovelling, declaring himself to be unworthy to be called a son. He's treating his father like an employer. And the father stops him before he can say that rehearsed line, "Treat me like one of your servants." And he tells his servants to lavish on his son the honours that were due to an obedient firstborn son. A great feast, shoes and a robe, a ring on his finger signifying full sonship. So the son returned empty, but now he is filled to overflowing with more than he could have imagined or hoped for. At this point in our story, Naomi stands like this estranged but returned son, broken, empty. She's speaking out her rehearsed speech. The Lord's hand has gone out against me, I'm bitter. But she's unaware of the abundant generosity that's about to be poured out on her as her father shows himself to be true to his covenant love and promises. Yes, we are prone to wander, but the Father's more prone to seek us and to welcome us home. No amount of wandering can annul his grace. Now, within this chiasm of the chapter, there sits another little chiasm, verses 16 to 17. It's a beautiful poem, or you could even describe it as a song, both in its content and in its structure. And English translations, I think, don't capture its poetic nature. We can see, again, laying it out this way, we see its symmetry as well as its main point. The central idea is Ruth embracing Naomi, her people, and her God. Now note that I've put shall be there in italics because the Hebrew isn't necessarily in the future tense. It simply says, your people, your God, my God. And that distinction I don't think is minor. See, the future translation makes God and his people becoming Ruth's God and her people based on Ruth's pledge of loyalty. Because of my oath now, God will become my God and your people will become my people. But the present tense translation makes her pledge dependent upon God. See, Ruth already belongs to Naomi's people. And to break that bond then would be unthinkable. It's not Ruth's strength of will or resolve that's made this union. It's the action of God, which has already happened, that gives her the strength to remain within the covenant that actually began 10 years ago when Ruth was brought into Naomi's family through marriage. That's when she was brought into God's grace and goodness. Now, there are statements in the Bible that seem on their own to imply that God's faithfulness to us depends on our actions, that our actions come first and then God will show his faithfulness to us. For example, we may read this one: "Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, "Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" Jesus answered, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." Now, on its own, that sounds like the Father's love for us depends on our love and obedience for him. If you love me, then the Father will love you. But we need to see it in the context of what Jesus has just said before this. "Because I live, you also will live. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you." See, first comes this covenant union with the Son, and through the Son with the Father, and from that flows our love for him and our obedience to his commands. And then through that obedience will come not the actual but the subjective experience of the Father's love and the presence of the Son manifested among us and with us. God's action has come first, and we respond to that. This covenant love is what Ruth is expressing. She knows Naomi's God, and she knows her people, and this flows into this fierce allegiance to Naomi that will stand in life and in death. Ruth begins her song with a strong command that matches Naomi's strong command to her daughters to return to Moab, to leave. She's not requesting, she is commanding. Far be it for a daughter-in-law to tell her mother-in-law what to do. But this matter is so critical that it actually overrides cultural propriety. She's telling her mother-in-law. Her strong opening words then, "Do not urge me," are matched by her closing words. Her oath, which also shows the covenantal nature of this poem. She doesn't say here what the Lord should do to her if she breaks her oath, just "may the Lord do so to me," but in this structure we see that the answer is in that opening line. "May the Lord leave me. May he abandon me if I don't do what I have pledged." See how the impossibility of God's covenant promises being broken is the basis for her promises to Naomi. Don't make any promises presuming that you'll have the power in yourself to keep them. Only make promises that you know that the Lord, from his word, has said he will enable you to keep. Now, in Ruth's song, we see another irony, another dilemma. This young Moabite woman seems to know more about covenant relationships than the older Israelite woman. Naomi saw her relationship with these women as something that can be ended by something other than death. She's willing to see them return, not just to their families, but to their gods. Now, Jews were supposed to rehearse to themselves the Lord's covenant promises and the covenant requirements. That was part of their confession of faith and their identity. But the first confession of covenant faithfulness in this book actually comes not from the mouth of a Jew, but from a Moabite woman. Someone who was considered as far from God's covenant as anyone could be. We might imagine Jesus, if he was standing there, of course he was there, wasn't he? But physically standing there, imagine Jesus saying, as what he said when he witnessed the faith of a Roman centurion. He marvelled to himself and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So we, like Jesus, should marvel and rejoice at the grace of God that's been extended to a Moabite and a Roman who express that in their words of faith. But at the same time, we should be shocked and dismayed at the prospect of judgment coming upon faithless Israel. So the writer hits us with a second question to ponder. Not only is the Lord different or better than all the gods of the nations, but can it be that there is more faith among pagan Moabites than there is among those who claim to be the Lord's people? Now, at this point, the answer seems to be yes. Not because they're any better, but because of his grace. But we'll have to wait and see how these two questions will eventually be answered as we continue through this book.